Hey guys, first of all, I want to ask you to do me a solid favor, and that's subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notification, like the video, and share the video as well. There is various ways to subscribe as well. I do have a new subscribe button you will see depending on how you're watching this audio video. It will pop up, and if not, there's also the subscribe button when you look up the information. But like I said, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, share the video, and like the video. Also, there's various other places you can find my content. You can find me at all your various audio and video podcast affiliates like iTunes, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Audible, Amazon Music, Spotify, SiriusXM, Radio Public, and many others. Wherever there's a podcast to be found, you'll probably find mine there as well. Also, support me and follow me over at rumble.com, VENMO.com, and Odyssey.com, and even dailymotion.com. There are areas there that will allow, those are areas, I should say, video content wise, where you can find more of my content, similar here to what you have on YouTube, but there are videos there, content videos there that YouTube, I would probably be able to get away with them here, but it would either cause me to get demonetized in a big way or have my monetization limited, so I don't want to take that chance. So you can find them, you can find them over in those various areas. Also, guys, support me over at patreon.com. I got plans for the Patreon. I'll let you know what those are when the time is right. Also, support me over at Cash App and Venmo. Be greatly appreciated if you can. And there are two stores you can find merchandise at. I got my new Force Wall store open. One thing's up right now, but there will be more coming in the future. And there's the OG Teespring store where you can find merchandise you can't get anywhere else. And during this video's premiere, you will notice that live chat is open. So if you want to come on in during the live chat, give your thoughts on the topic here, as well as even donate through SuperChats if you can. It'd be greatly appreciated. And then afterwards, Super Thanks will be open after the premiere of the video. But with that said, let's get on to the topic. And I want to give a shout out to Andre Meadows of Black Nerd Comedy. He basically went and did something of a Black Nerd rant, if you will, on Power Rangers, and basically, just gave his thoughts on how basically they could, they could put Power Rangers back into the spotlight, like they did around 2017, because you had various Power Ranger, I guess you could say, shows or content, if you will. He was actually part of the Hyperforce content, but yeah, you had various Power Rangers. You had something on television and streaming. You had the Hyperforce that he was part of, and you had the Power Ranger movie that came out, the more darker, grittier PG-13 one. So he gave his thoughts on that, and it got me thinking, maybe I can try something similar. So shout out to him for the inspiration. But, as I've alluded to before, there's a lot of things going on with shipping at times when it comes to animation or comics and all that. And we always feel like, it's just blatantly obvious, that they are trying to tell us something with certain, moments throughout the shows or certain moments throughout throughout a comics run and everything. They're trying to tell us something. Even with anime, they're trying to tell us something. But the question is, why don't they go through with it? Why don't they just, acknowledge it in some fashion? Now, I've talked about this before, I think about a month or two ago, but it's true. It's like, why don't they, in the show or in the comics have, the characters involved in the situation, acknowledge, what's going on? Why don't they just come out and say something, to put, to put a lot of fans, a lot of shippers, as they're called, minds at ease? Why don't they just say something? And I think the reason, and I've alluded to this before, I think the reason we don't get it that much, if you will, we don't get it at all probably, is due to the fact that if they come out, that being the writers, if they come out and they have a character, acknowledge, what's going on, or at least, admit to what's going on, that it can ruin the dynamic of what the show or what the comic is about. So if they have a character, come out and say, hey, I know how you feel about me and da da da, or hey, I know what's going on here and da da da, it could ruin, the show and maybe the character. So they don't want to do that. They don't want to do that until they feel the time is right. And sometimes when the time is right is when a story is properly built. And that story being properly built is able to get a lot of fans that at first may not be, fond of the ship. It gives, if a story is properly built, it gives them the opportunity to to hopefully further understand why the ship is going to happen, why this couple is going to happen, and everything. And hopefully, if the story is good enough to give that explanation, hopefully as well, the fans that may not be fond of it at first will be more accepting, like, oh, okay, they'll be like, okay, we see now why they have to be together, or why you're building to them being together and all that. It's like, okay, we see that now. We understand that now. And, to me, that's why you don't have, you don't have, you know, um, the creators outright, outright basically telling you what the ship is going to be, right off the bat. Even though you as a fan can pretty much kind of put the pieces together and kind of in your own mind, from your own point of view, kind of, by putting those pieces together, you can kind of see maybe that this is the direction they're going to go. It's not a guarantee, but it almost feels like that's what they want to do. And I'm perfectly fine with that. You know, being someone that grew up in the 80s and the 90s and all that, and still watched, cartoons and read comics into the 2000s and such, and even up to today, for someone that's been doing that for over 40 years, you know, I can, I can understand mainly why you want to, I can understand mainly why you want to build to that moment, you know, in the show or in the comics, or if you don't want to address it at all and you just want the fans to kind of like put the pieces of the puzzle together themselves. I can understand that. You know, for for me, I've said this on numerous occasions. I've watched the Disney Afternoon, since its inception, since the original lineup. And not only have I watched the Disney Afternoon since its original lineup, but one of those shows I've watched since even prior to its inclusion in the Disney Afternoon was Gummy Bears. And I've always felt like, depending on how you look at it, in my opinion, you know, you have Cubby and Sunny, and here's why I always supported this ship actually happening down the line if they ever age the characters up. The one reason is because they never outright said that, these characters were related in some capacity. They never outright said that. And also, you always had these characters hanging out with each other. Even if Sunny, and his name is spelled Sunni, even if you had Sunny wanting to try to impress someone like Gusto, or maybe get along better with someone like Buddy Barbic and all that, it always felt like to me she was destined for Cubby. Now you might say Cubby is too young for her and everything, but here's the thing: if he was too young, why did she always constantly play with him? Why was she always around him and everything? You know? And you might say, well, it's because, he's the only other kid around, so it makes sense for them to, it makes sense for them to play with each other when there's no one else around to play with. And that's true. That's true, but I also think it all depends, honestly, in my opinion, on who writes the stories. That's what it depends on. It all depends on who writes the stories, because I can tell you there's been various stories in comics and in cartoons to where you could tell who's writing what, and basically giving the final okay on what, because you can because the way you could see that is if something something feels different and everything, like something feels different, and then later on in the next, on like the next day, and on the next day or the next week in the next episode, I'm trying to say, that's what I'm trying to say, is in the next time with a new episode, you notice that there's a difference in tone. Like, there's one episode where Cubby is left out from voting, given his chance to vote and everything, because he's too young, right? Or they felt he's not ready yet. And he has to basically prove himself by proving to everybody else that, hey, I know what's going on. I've discovered what's going on. And when they see that he's right about it, he's earned his keep. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. Sunny, she's also young, but yet she's able to vote. So again, you could tell, again, the dynamics shift and everything differently depending on the writers. And you could tell that in a way the writers kind of knew that if they wanted to go any further with gummy bears in the future, maybe even age up the characters, that we were destined to get a Cubby and Sunny coupling. That's what we were destined to get. We were destined to get a coupling between the two. And that's a fact. I don't think anybody could deny that. And you look around, there is artwork that kind of backs that up. Not official artwork, but fan artwork that kind of backs that up. You know, I mean, just the fact that the way they would hug each other and everything. I mean, the way Cubby was urgent to rescue Sunny in the episode of Gummy in a Gilded Cage, and in the way she reacted when he came and got her out of that cage, it's like you cannot tell me that outside of what people would consider like BFF material or sibling material, you can't tell me that there wasn't, that wasn't done on purpose, and that's one of the earlier episodes. But you can't tell me that wasn't done on purpose as to indicate that, hey, if we go any further with this, this might be, the direction we go in if we age them up, you know. And like I said, there's a lot of different, situations. There's a lot of different moments, throughout the run of the show to where they're paired up in a way to where not only do they have to, take care of something like with a sleeping, like putting a giant to sleep or going after this plant and everything, you know, there's just so many indications, in my opinion, to where I think they really were setting this up. They were just setting this up and everything, but we never got to see if that was going to be the resolution. We never did. We never got to see if that was going to be the resolution or anything, going forward. But it was always them together. It was always them together, and not just because they were the youngest. That was primarily it. But also the fact that, to me, they wanted to go further with the characters. I just feel it. And I feel that if they did, let's say, put Gummy Bears in that category of it being one of the Disney Afternoon movies that was going to be planned for the original Disney Afternoon theatrical run after, which DuckTales Treasure of the Lost Lamp initiated, had they probably had that in the works, I wouldn't have been surprised if they aged up the characters to the point that, yeah, we might get a romance. We might have, I should say, might have got a romance between the two in the movie, if that all came to be. But again, we'll never know. But like I said, I've always felt like there was just so, and I've mentioned this before with any other ships out there, and especially one I've talked about before, and I'll talk about again. But to me, there's just too many moments, moments of them, hugging each other, kind of dancing around with each other, and all that. There's too many moments, in my opinion, not to basically at least kind of, think about, kind of speculate at the fact that this felt like, Disney was, dropping hints that, this could have been the direction it could have gone in. Yeah, you could say you could probably say, oh, they were planting the seeds for Sunny and Buddy Barbic. That's true. That might be true to an extent. And some of you might say, well, what if they were also planting the seeds for Sunny and Gusto? And that's a good, question to ask as well and speculate. But to me, even though you probably had Buddy and Sunny just, together once, and the same with and the whole Gusto infatuation by Sunny was a mini story in itself. To me, out of all of that, though, it felt more like, they wanted to do Cubby and Sunny if they had aged them up. Now, I don't know if they would basically come out and say that, but I felt like that was the direction they were going to go in. I know Tad Stones would deny it, but I think he doesn't want to say anything because I think even he, in my opinion, feels that that was going to be the direction they would have gone in had they continued the series, maybe done a movie and aged the characters up. I think he knows that would have been the direction. But again, that's neither. But again, this is all speculation on my part. But I feel the more you pair characters together, young characters that will age over time in the story, the more you pair them together, in my opinion, the more they interact with each other, the more they have similarities, and in this case, having human best friends like Cubby with Calvin and Sunny with Kala. You know, to me, the more you do that, and it's to me, the more what I'm trying to say is the more you do that. I'm getting a little tongue tied. I'm trying to do this as quickly as I can because of reasons. But like I said, the more you do this, the more evidence it becomes, or more evident it becomes to the viewer, to the fans, that you're going to go in that direction. That's what you plan to do in the near future. Because it was obvious that, the two human friends were being set up to get together, that being Calvin and Calvin and Kala, I should say. It was being obvious that was going to happen. So why not go the same route with the two humans, two best friends in the gummies? I'm just saying. And the thing is, it's not just gummy bears either. Like I've alluded to before, and I've talked about this recently too. You look at Rescue Rangers, and I know people would say Dale and Foxglove because it's pretty much confirmed in the Boom Studio comic continuation or sub continuation. And that's true. But if you put that aside, if you take that out of the equation, in my opinion, and just look at the original cartoon as a whole, and you also put the 2002 movie aside and act like that's an alternate universe kind of deal, and just look at the original cartoon as a whole, in my opinion, they were setting things up with Dale and Gadget. And it's just, again, if you watch all 65 episodes, if you look at all 65 episodes, of Rescue Rangers, there is more Dale and Gadget interactions, if you will, from an affectionate standpoint and all that, than there is between Chip and Gadget, you know. And I'm not saying that Chip and Gadget didn't have interactions, and I know people felt like they would have the better dynamic, but again, I just felt that there was just too much out there not to at least, really give fans something to think about. Because one, I think the biggest evidence was Double O Chipmunk. I really do. Double O Chipmunk to me was probably the biggest evidence that they were probably going to go with a Dale and Gadget romance. Because in case you guys don't know, and I'm sure you do, one of the movies that was on the slate, for the Disney afternoon to have a theatrical run after DuckTales was Rescue Rangers. And I've always felt like if they would have done that, if they would have been able to see that through originally, that would have been the movie. That would have been the movie. Well, not only would that have been a movie, I should say, but that would have been the story. That's what I'm trying to say. That would have been a movie and story. That's what I'm trying to say. Of where we would finally get Gadget's decision. Who is she going to be with? Is she going to be with Chip? Is she going to be with Dale? And I think honestly, that story in that movie would have been where she chose Dale. That's what I'm trying to say. Because again, there's just so much, so much evidence, too many moments between them affectionately, affectionately and, friendly wise and all that, throughout the entire series, almost from the beginning. So why not basically just go all the way through with that, in what was going to be the original OG movie? Why not go all the way through with that? To me, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense, in my opinion. And again, I understand you gave Dale a love interest, or seemingly gave him a love interest at the end of Good Times, Bad Times. I get that, and it's kind of confirmed as an on and off, if not permanent solution in the Boom Studio run. But again, if you take that aside, put that on the shelf, and you take the very meta 2020 movie or 2022 movie, you put that on the side, put that on the shelf, you know, and you just focus on the original OG show itself, then I think it's obvious I think it's obvious to me, and I think it would be obvious to you, they were setting something up between Dale and Gadget. It just felt that way, in my opinion. I just feel that's what they were doing. Could I be wrong? Could I be wrong on it? Absolutely. But I think, despite what Tad Stones, who worked on the show, and anybody else will tell you who worked on the show, I believe that's the direction they were heading in. I truly do. They might say oppositely. They might say, "Oh, we never had plans to do this and that." But let's be honest. If you didn't have plans, then why did you put those moments in there? I'm just saying. I'm just saying. But that's just coming from me. But you know what? There's a lot of other fans, D and G fans as they call themselves, that would agree, and maybe even all overall Rescue Ranger fans that would agree. But it wasn't just Rescue Rangers either. I mean, you look at the following series, Tailspin, it was obvious from the get-go and throughout the series run that you were going to pair Baloo and Becky together, Baloo and Rebecca together, almost from the get-go. And the fact that you want to say that that their pairing is based off, the fictional pairing of Rebecca Dollison and Sam Malone from Cheers, it's like how much more how much more evidential, or how much more evidence, I should say, do you need to give to people, of the show, fans of the show? How much more evidence do you need to give them? How much more fuel to the fire do you have to put on to basically just outright tell them, yeah, we will go, yeah, the plan is to do Baloo and Rebecca, and how many episodes, how many moments, centers around that? A lot does. Star is Torn is pretty much, indicating from beginning to end, these two ended up together. End of story. But the thing is, we never got a true resolution. You might say when the DuckTales reboot came out, we got somewhat of a resolution. Maybe we did. Maybe we didn't. We don't know. We don't know. All we saw in the reboot was the aged up versions of Kit Kicker and Molly Cunningham, Rebecca's daughter. And that's it. So to me, once again, we got evidence more so than I think anybody would expect, basically saying Baloo, Rebecca together, end of story. Just like with all the moments we had in Rescue Rangers, pretty much saying Dale and Gadget together, end of story. But they weren't the only shows. Now the shows that followed pretty much already gave you official couples, or at least teased maybe at a couple happening even though they were kids. The official couples in Darkwing Duck, well, Morgana and Darkwing Duck Drake Mallard. The tease that they had, even though they were young, was Gosselin and Honker. So that's the tease. That's like, yeah, they were young and everything, but it felt like, hey, if they would have gone and aged them up and done a movie and all that like planned, maybe there would have been something. And, Goof Troop, you don't have to worry about that because pretty much we know what happens there, and pretty much we got bleeds into Goofy movie and such, and so on and so on. Bonkers, don't worry about that because we know Bonkers and Fawn, Lucky and Deal, no problem there. Aladdin, no problem there. Gargoyles, we knew what was going to happen from the beginning with Goliath and Elisa. But then we get to Mighty Ducks. Mighty Ducks, to me, is an interesting scenario. Because you had two female members on the team. You had the other members being male. And to me, out of most of them, there was three choices for both Mallory and Tanya. Tanya, I felt, could be someone that, they paired her up several times with Nosedive. That basically, I think they were planning maybe they were planning maybe to give the hint that Tanya and Nosedive would be an item. And again, nothing against that, because that sounds interesting. It really does. But I feel like what they were planning to do, especially with that one episode, which kind of served as a follow-up, a sequel to the pilot, to the movie pilot, when they finally had the detective kind of, get on their side and everything, to me, it felt like Tanya was more into Wild Wing, just the way she was, thinking that he got killed and then saying, shooting off a puck and saying, this is for you, Wild Wing, and all that, and then being surprised he's alive. When he says thanks, appreciated, it's like I think they wanted to do something there. I really did. I really did want to think they wanted to do something there. And then you take a look at Duke, and you take a look at Mallory, and people say, well, obviously based on that one episode where Duke had to basically go undercover and try to, basically foil the plan of, the plans of his former colleague who was a hired henchman of their enemy and everything. People might say, well, you look at that episode and the way Mallory was always judging Duke and didn't have to apologize. It's like it's too evident that they were planning a Duke and Mallory deal, and I think so too. I think so too that kind of laid the groundwork. for something like that to be looked at. But I also look at the fact that, just the interaction between all of them, or between both of them. I think honestly they wanted to do Mallory and Nosedive. I think, this is my opinion. I think out of all the possibilities, out of the, romantically to come out of Mighty Ducks from a coupling perspective, I think they would have gone with Nosedive and Mallory just based on the fact that they are the perfect definition of opposites attract. Just based on that. And the fact there is fan art, there is fan fiction based around those two being together. And I've seen it and I've read it. And as far as like, who would Wild Wing get if maybe there was a choice with him? I think Wild Wing would probably end up, like I said, with Tanya. I really do. You know, and a Tanya nosedive deal would have been good. A Duke and Tanya deal would have been nice. But if I was to basically look at, a top three perspective, like who was the likely and not likely, or maybe, yeah, would it be a top three? Yeah, it would be. Well, actually, be a top four. We'll put it that way. If I was looking at it from a top four perspective of likely and not likely, at number one, the most likely to me to actually happen, that would have actually happened in the series if allowed, I think the most likely would have been Nosedive and Mallory at number one. I think second most likely would have been Mallory and Duke. I think third most likely would have been Tanya and Wild Wing. I think fourth most likely would have been Wild Wing and Mallory. And actually, this is a top five. We'll put it that top five, top six. We'll put it that way. But like I said, number one in my opinion, most likely would have been Nosedive Mallory. Second would have been Duke and Mallory. Third would have been Wild Wing and Wild Wing and Tanya. Now, I think I said that right. And then fourth, I think would have been Wild Wing and Mallory. And fifth, I believe, would have been Nosedive and Tanya. And then I think sixth would have been Tanya and Duke. That's just the way I look at it. That's just the way I rank them. Nosedive Mallory, Duke Mallory, Wild Wing Mallory. I think Wild Wing Tanya, Nosedive Tanya, and then Duke and Tanya. That's the way I look at it, honestly. Because again, when you look at how Mallory and Nosedive interact with each other, when she basically, takes this cloning thing from, or not this holographic cloning thing, if you will, from Wild Wing, which they're going to use for like target practice and all that. When she takes it from him, and then he asks, "Well, what are you gonna do? More target practice?" And and Mallory's reaction or Mallory's answer is no. But the next time Nosedive wants to put worms in my boots, I'm gonna give him the fright of his life. It's like you can't tell me there's not something there if she wants to do that to him. Or the fact that she replies to him when he basically sees the ally show up to him in one of his comic books, and she's like, "Nosedive, I think you've had one spicy taco too many," and stuff like that. Or the way the way he goes with. Hold on for a sec. All right, sorry about that, but like I said, to me, like I said, just the fact that the interaction between them and all that, it just felt like they wanted to probably go that route and everything. And then again, you take a look at the end of one of the episodes. I think the Buzz Blitzman episode and everything. Basically, you have Nosedive going with him and Mallory in the arrow ring, just to fly around and have fun because, obviously Mallory, because the episode basically was, you know, centered around this new character that I think if they'd done more seasons, he would have been more prevalent, or more prevalent, if you will. But basically, he has a crush on Mallory, and then Mallory kind of gets on him about it, and she doesn't realize, hey, this kid likes you. Don't be so hard on him, and she realizes she is, and she has to make it up to him, and all that, and Nosedive gets, basically thrown into it because Wild Wing says, hey, go with her, help her out, and basically, everything, turns out all right. Everything turns out all right, but still, to me, it's like to me they were just planting too many seeds, in my opinion, to set those two up, if you will. Like even this episode where he adopts this alien being, and just the way it takes to him and all that, it kind of puts an impression, if you will, like a motherly impression on both Mal and Tan, if you will. And I'm thinking, okay, that's evidence right there, not just for Mal, but with Tom. But Mal, to me, it's like even before that, you have all this evidence and everything. All the other moments, I'm thinking, yeah, that's just another moment you want to add in there. But you also can add in Tanya as well to that. And then what she says afterwards when they're looking for him and everything, especially I think after he goes out of his cocoon thing and becomes this monstrous thing, she's basically tells him, hey, if your little friend tries to make a meal out of me, he says, okay, fine. She's like, she agrees to help look for him, but then she's like, if your little friend tries to make a meal out of me, he's toast and everything, or something along that lines, something along that line and all that. But to me, I just felt like there was just so many moments. There was just maybe not a lot of moments, but just enough moments to indicate, in my opinion, that they wanted to they wanted to do Mallory and Nosedive. This is just obvious to me, just really obvious. But again, that's just my opinion because, like I said, they had a lot of options. They had Duke and Mallory they could have gone with, Wild Wing and Tanya, Nosedive and Tanya, Duke and Tanya. They could have done it all. Grin, pretty much he's his own guy. It's like he'd rather be zenning for like 24/7, if you will. He'd rather be zenning for 24/7 than do anything else. Do anything else. But anyway, though, I look at that and I'm like, come on, it's obvious. It's obvious you want to see you. It's obvious. But what I'm trying to say is, I'm like, okay, well, I'm getting tongue tied, guys. Hold on. Sorry, the phone ringing and everything kind of threw me off a little bit. But like I said, it's just too obvious, in my opinion, that they were planting the seed to at least acknowledging that if they were to do a romance in there, because why would any shows or comics do this kind of stuff unless they were just saying, hey, if we did this, this is probably who we'd go with. And to me, that's the most obvious thing. The most obvious evidence that if they do things like that, it's just a way of saying, hey, if we decide to do it, this is who we're going to go with. This is who we're going to, put out there as being, the romance of the show, of the franchise, of the comic, that. And then speaking of comics, you have the same thing. I mean, Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic and Sally, obvious, no doubt. But again, there's so many moments in there as well that you wouldn't expect. Like for example, Bunny and Antoine. The moment they had that kiss at the end of what was it, issue 18, 16, or whatever it was, that moment right there, pretty much, I think, hinted at, okay, if we're gonna pair Bunny up with somebody or Antoine up with somebody, it's gonna probably be with each other. And guess what happened? That's what they did, and they continued on even into the soft reboot. But then you take a look at Tails, and you're like, well, who would they pair him up with? Well, Tails had all kinds of suitors, in my opinion. He had, well, not suitors, but he had all kinds of love interests, I should say, in my opinion. One of the big ones, the most prominent ones outside of Fiona, was Babarai Koala. Babarai Koala, from the Down Under Freedom Fighters. And they pretty much just plainly put it right in front of your face, I think, in issue 62. Yeah, she's got a thing for Tails, and obviously Tails has a thing for her. So it's just, it was just to me right in front of your face the moment they did that. And it's like, okay, if you couldn't be more evident that you're going to put those two together, I don't know, I don't know what more evidence you need. Or you're teasing something between them. But what's interesting though is despite the fact that they've even kind of teased maybe before she had her design changed to coincide with the adventure Sonic Adventure games and all that. It almost felt like, and even afterwards, it almost felt like they wanted to tease a Tails and Amy deal, which was okay, I think, because hey, they're young and everything, not that far off in age. It's like that makes sense. And what's even crazier is you look at Satayam, mostly what Season 3's doing, or Team Season's doing, to revive it. And then you even look at this one little short they did, focusing on Bunny being someone that was basically outsmarting coconuts in a Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner kind of fashion. And you look at the ending to where basically you got her, you got Bunny, and you got Sally in these dresses. You got Tails and Sonic in these tuxes. It's almost like a double date. It's like Sonic's gonna take Sally, Tails is taking Bunny. It's like, okay, that's interesting. But then you take a look at, like I said, what Team Season's doing, and having Bunny and Tails getting along with each other, in the dancing together in the celebration. And it's like, okay, it's just an aunt or pseudo aunt, if you will, having fun with her nephew, quote unquote. But people can interpret that the wrong way, if you know what I'm saying, based on what they, as longtime fans, would point out. But it's not just. But here's the thing: they're not the only ones fans want Tails to be with. Even though it's not prominently shown in the comics at all, pre or post reboot, here's what's interesting. Fans have always had an affinity to put Tails with Nicole, the HoloLink. And it's like, why? And I think it's mainly because she's ageless. She could be any age he needs. And also because she's a BFF of Sally. So him being the BFF of Sonic, a lot of people felt like, hey, it makes sense. Put them together. So it's just one of those situations to where even if you had the moments, and they did have moments in there, friendly moments, between them in the comics, you know, it's just one of those situations to where now, it's the fans that are taking those moments and saying, hey, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. Just like they've done with all the other pairings that I've mentioned before. You know, that you put on all these teases, you have all these moments and all that, these opposites attract situations, and it's like, if you're not going to do something about it, we're going to do something about it. And they do. They end up doing it. So, overall, in general, and in closing, I just wanted to come on here and again shout out to Black Nerd Comedy, Andre Meadows for inspiration of doing this. But I just wanted to talk about, the fact that, you know, you had about the fact that pairings get teased, and when they're teased but not followed through, it ends up being the fans that follow it through. And sometimes the fans will take even the smallest moments and say, hey, let's run with it. And that's what they do, like let's say with Tails and Nicole. But let me know what your thoughts are, guys, in the comment section. Love to hear each and every one of your thoughts on what I've had to say here. If you haven't already said something in the live chat during the premiere of this video. And until next time, guys, like I said, do me a favor, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, and like I said, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video. I was trying to say that. Like I said, I'm trying to do this as quickly as I can because of circumstances, timely circumstances. But let me know what your thoughts are, though, on what I've had to say. And again, support me in all the areas as I mentioned at the beginning. Support me there and follow me in those areas as well. We'd be greatly, greatly appreciated. But guys, that's all I'm going to say until now. Oh, that's all I'm going to say for now, I should say. And until next time, again, give me your thoughts. Love to hear from each and every one of you on this. Let me know if you've noticed any of the things I've mentioned here, from any of the stuff I've mentioned, any of the couples or teases and all that I've mentioned. Let me know what your thoughts are. And until next time, I am out.